President Obama and spokesperson, Senior Director at National Security Council, and MSNBC contributor, former FBI double agent Naveed Jamali, Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Ned, I want to start with you because you were a spokesperson in the White House, and to me, one of the most astounding things that's happened in the last 24 hours is a staffer of the president picking a fight with a London mayor. As the bodies have not been identified, counted, I mean, we are talking in the midst of this horror. A staffer is picking a fight. This is Dan Scavino referring back to a tweet from the mayor of London who was responding to then candidate Trump's Muslim ban call, talking about it being an ignorant view of Islam. And here's Scavino saying, refer to below tweet 13 months ago after you criticized now President real Donald Trump and wake up. This is a point scoring, dunking on someone from a Twitter staffer to an actual head of the city of London. I've never seen anything remotely like this.
It's, Chris, very difficult to imagine this is the reality we are living in just 4 months into the Trump administration. Look, one of the most powerful weapons in our national security and foreign policy arsenal is the presidential bully pulpit. It is the voice of the commander-in-chief. Going back through history, it's not only the FDR quote that Josh mentioned, but it's President Kennedy telling Khrushchev that we would not submit to nuclear weapons in Cuba. It's President Reagan telling Gorbachev to tear down that wall. It's President George H.W. Bush telling Iraq that aggression against Kuwait would not stand. That is what the world looks to when there is a crisis, when there is a challenge that we're collectively facing. And with these antics, both President Trump and his top aides, including Dan Scavino in this case, have diluted a powerful, perhaps one of the most powerful weapons in our arsenal. By weakening this weapon, the president will have less credibility now when push comes to shove, and he's called upon to serve in that ever-important role as commander-in-chief.
And Naveed, the subtext here, which is important, is it gets down to the president's views on Islam and on Muslims and the degree to which they are implicated or suspect as a class. This is a man who called on a ban. London has a Muslim mayor, Sadiq Khan, who spoke incredibly movingly about his connection to his faith and how he viewed these attacks through that prism. And it seems inescapable to me that that's part of the subtext of this back and forth.
Absolutely, Chris. I couldn't agree with you more there. And look, besides the sort of, the Muslim component here, there's also a practical one here. And I'm sure Ned can expand on this as well. But the idea is that when you're coming from a law enforcement perspective, you can only go so far. You cannot necessarily affect an arrest. And as we're looking at terrorists, in many cases, they don't actually commit anything illegal until they actually perpetrate the act. Right. On the intelligence side, it's the same problem. When you're looking outside of the continental United States, looking outside the UK, what that means is that as a law enforcement or an intelligence officer, you rely on the community as part of that first line of defense. And so just as a practical matter, when the President of the United States comes out and the reaction to a terrorist attack is to push a Muslim ban, it's going to do nothing more. And look, I've gotten emails from people that are case officers that complain that their assets are very concerned about this. When you have the President of the United States coming out and saying, pushing a Muslim ban, it makes it not only harder to recruit people in that community, it makes it harder to retain them. And that's, look, when you talk about terrorism, that is just giving up a massive line of defense that we have against this, this scourge.
Ned, how do you balance, I guess the question for me is, how do you have the rest of the government deal with this at the center? It's a strange question, but at this point, it is what it is. The president's going to tweet, and it seems to me that basically we're asking for the other institutions of governance to deal around this in the midst of it. You saw it with the acting ambassador who's running the embassy in the UK, acting like a normal, gracious ally while the president is tweeting this feud.
Yeah, Chris, it makes the challenge incredibly difficult. Look, leadership flows from the top, and I think you saw that reflected in Secretary Mattis's remarks over the weekend when he told an international gathering to, quote unquote, bear with us. He essentially told them, look, we'll get there in the end. It'll be messy, but just bear with us in the meantime. That is not the message that we should be sending to our allies, nor is it the message that they want to hear. Our allies, our partners, even our adversaries need to know where we stand, who we are, what we're for, what we're against, and that is not something that we're getting in the mess of this administration, unfortunately.
Naveed, do you think this country's reaction to these sorts of events as they're happening abroad is changing over time?
You know, I do. I think that, look, again, with the president come out and saying this, and his response not being to offer support or condemnation and just leave it at that. Look, Chris, I remember, you know, I am someone who judges history in terms of pre-9/11, post-9/11. That was a defining moment for me and for many of my generation. And I think that for many of us, it was a call to support our country. And I suspect in the UK, there's a lot of that same feeling. And I think that, again, when you take a tack that seeks to attack sort of marginalized communities already, it does nothing more than hurt that, and it doesn't help, you know, it doesn't push anything forward. It doesn't have a real dialogue as to how we can fix what is a gap between intelligence and law enforcement, which does exist. You know, that is a conversation we have to have, but when the President of the United States is instead going after these marginalized communities, it doesn't further that discussion.
All right.
And Chris, we should forget there's another real practical element to this. Terrorism is a tactic designed to instill fear and terror in those who are watching, and President Trump actually hyped the threat. He played into this, and he gave the terrorists the victory they didn't achieve.
I just want to say that the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people at Manchester, to me, was so remarkable, because that's, you know, this has just happened, and they're out there, and that I couldn't think of a better response. Ned Price, Naveed Jamali, thanks to you both.